Hello everybody, it's me, Player Negative, and today I decided to up my game with this era because this is both the most memeable and laughable, but also intriguing era of Sonic, the Dark Era. Now, for those of you who do not know, this is when the 2010s really dove into irony poisoning, which I'll get into in a minute, but generally it was starting to be a mid-section downfall of Sonic as a franchise, which went to a lot of controversy of people saying Sonic was never good, even though we all know for a fact that that's not true in the slightest. And even though he's got himself back up now, it's worth mentioning these problems so we learn to push past them and move forward. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Alright, our first contender of the bunch, Sonic 06. Or just Sonic the Hedgehog, for those of you who refuse to call it by its name that the fandom has dubbed it. This was the first of the cross-platform games to show up for Sonic in his career. Now, this is a very big issue about this game because not only is it a buggy mess, but also it was around a time when Sega dropped out of the console wars. So they didn't really have a single console to put this on. So, honestly, they didn't understand how to handle other hardwares and certain things about the new members of the Sonic team. Basically, a lot of things didn't exactly work out. And the animation itself is kind of really bad. So, there's a lot to cover here. However, the one thing it doesn't lack is its story, which we are going to get into right now. The game itself has a special three-way character mechanic, where you switch between playing as Sonic, Shadow, and Silver. Shadow's stages are more combat-orientated, Sonic's are more speed-orientated, and Silver's are more puzzles-based. But there was also a symbolic representation between these three hedgehogs, as the time period since this game, like other Sonic games, evolved around time travel. Sonic represents the present that exists in the now, Shadow represents the past, evidenced by his dark past and how it's shaped him into a completely different character from what he was from the beginning, and Silver represents the future because this new character actually hails from the future. And we'll get into him right now. Silver the Hedgehog is one of the most interesting yet misused characters in the entire Sonic franchise. His story follows that he lived in a ruined future of the world and seek to protect it using his telekinetic abilities. When an opportunity arose to fix his future by using the Chaos Emeralds to time travel, he managed to do so in a pretty abrupt way, but he didn't understand what caused the destruction of his worlds. Naturally, one of the main villains of the game, Mephiles, who looks a little something like this, Mephiles basically disguises himself to look like Shadow or a random hedgehog to seem trusting to him, and basically pins the blame in the destruction of his future on Sonic. Now, because Silver, similar to Knuckles, lives in isolation and has a sense of innocence and moral standard, he generally believes that there's nothing in this obvious monster's face that tells him that he's lying. So, he immediately goes on a journey to kill Sonic. I'm not joking. This random guy just approached him, told him that that guy's responsible, and now this guy has an iron will to kill Sonic just because a random stranger told him to. Now, I don't understand this, but okay. You do you, Silver. Now, Silver himself is generally a lot more complex than what a lot of games let on. Why he is shown to be very immature sometimes or very, well, cowardly. He's actually quite brave and skilled in various situations. However, he feels generally that a lot of responsibility and skill falls on him that he simply can't carry. There's also a lot of things saying that he's autistic, and honestly, I can see it. I can kind of see it. He also has a lot of moral questions considering when it comes to actually killing Sonic later on with the story, because learning of Sonic being a hero, it makes him wonder if whether or not this is right for the sake of his own future. Also, now it's time for me to explain a little bit of development history on the side of things. For those of you who do not know, because I doubt there's anyone who doesn't, but I just think for clarity it's good, he is the only Dragon Ball inspired character in the entire Sonic series. I say only because there are a lot of people who love to take mental gymnastics and people who generally don't like this series and will constantly compare it to Dragon Ball only when the similarities are only surface level. So let me just explain this to you with a grain of salt so I don't sound crazy. Silver was inspired by the Dragon Ball character by the name of Future Trunks in terms of dilemma and abilities. However, the personality of both these two characters is completely different. The only difference between him and Silver, though, in their situation, is that there wasn't a powerful version of Gohan able to assist him. He was dealing with this all alone and by himself. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's get back to the main game storyline. So, Silver at first approaches Sonic like an obstacle in one of the most buggy boss fights ever known, where he basically uses his telekinesis to slam Sonic into a wall and try to corner him there. Now, eventually you can probably get out and defeat him, but there are a few caveats to some of the issues within the fights. A few of the stages are memorable and slightly ripped out of Adventure Heroes, but the game itself has a pretty interesting story revolving around the 3 hedgehogs that you play as. Sonic generally tries to help Silver and eventually gets through to him and is no longer considered a threat. However, Mephiles, the main villain of the game, still plans behind the scenes. Specifically, he tries to manipulate people into listening to him or following him by showing them the corrupt future that Silver is desperately trying to affect or prevent. A good example is Shadow. You see, Mephiles shows Shadow a future where basically everyone he fought for and everything he did was considered worthless, and he was locked up for people being feared of him. You gotta remember how powerful Shadow is, and that basically the US government essentially tried to get rid of him, but now has him under his recruitment. Shadow, of course, knowing how he is completely unfazed by this and immediately fights back against him, taking off his inhibitor rings. Now, for those of you who do not know what those are, the inhibitor rings are golden cuffs around Shadow's shoes and hands. And basically what they do is that they limit his power so he's able to control himself and so that it doesn't overexhaust him. However, when he takes them off, you better be scared because the amount of energy he's able to unleash with that amount of power is insane. To the point where he basically leveled an entire army with that. However, that's later on within the story, which is where we got to address one major issue. You see, while all of this is happening, I've basically been choosing to neglect Sonic's mainline the story, and the reason for that is pretty well justified if any Sonic fan who's played this game knows. You see, there is a kingdom in ruin that exists where basically the monster that Dark Gaia works for was sealed away in. But how they sealed it away was pretty much the most stupidest thing I have ever seen. Even people in The Legend of Zelda take better precautions when it comes to monsters like Ganon. So, basically, there was the king's daughter who they sealed the monster within, and basically the only way it would ever be released is if this child knew sadness. So they vowed to never shed a tear. Which at first doesn't sound so bad until you see it happens in the stupidest way possible. You see, halfway through the game after Sonic saves her, now an adult, Mephiles basically kills Sonic. But how he does is one of the most messed up ways possible. He gets shot directly in the back. Now, when I mean shot, I do not mean he got shot with a gun like Maria in Shadow's storyline. No. That's a completely different can of worms that's super controversial. I mean, the guy basically shot a giant laser that went directly through him. I am not joking, that actually happened. And this person saw Sonic as someone that meant a lot to him because they spent a lot of their life isolated from the rest of the world, and Sonic, who is a character who literally embodies freedom in certain narratives that he's been written in, basically shows them a sense of freedom or a sense of the world, and they appreciate that for them. So Sonic dying, you can imagine, can be pretty devastating for someone like this person. So, little buddy, yeah, I need to show you something that I think might hurt your eyes if you look at this. Now, to advise to all viewers, I am sorry for the very cursed scene in this game I am about to show you, but I think it's necessary to explain to you why this game flopped so much. Apart from its janky controls and its bad graphical design, the story was the main core part that was still okay. However, there was one scene that has been burnt into every Sonic's fan's eyes that I think you need to see. So, forgive me if I traumatize anyone here. Full disclaimer, you can skip this scene if you want, but just know you were warned. Alright, little buddy, I'm sorry I have to do this to you, but here, take a look at this. Yeah, that one scene is considered to be one of the most cursed things anyone's ever seen in a video game before. This is why the game got incredibly low scores, and to the point where everyone who saw this was scarred by it. To Sonic fans, this is basically like remembering Vietnam. And honestly, I can't blame them. I mean, Pokemon fans will look at this like it's nothing because we all know how that goes. But, dear God. I mean, this was the only major bump in the story, but still, you gotta think about what people were thinking about in the storyboarding room when they made this. Were a bunch of guys just talking, and then some random executive just said, alright, let's have him kiss someone he doesn't even know. Like, what the heck? I mean, you could have just had him revive with the normal Chaos Emeralds like every other game or story, but no, you had to basically curse everyone with that one scene. I apologize to anyone in the audience who has seen this, and generally, I can understand why. I am sorry. I am desperately sorry. All that insanity aside, and I mean that because all that is insanity. Please pass me the bleach right now so I can forget I ever looked at that. The next several games were good in story, but had very poorly made controls, but were better compared to this, and some of these games are even getting revisited to get rescored or looked at to see if they were truly actually bad, or if it was just nostalgia or irony poisoning, which it's about time I got into that before we get into the next 3 Sonic games. Now, irony poisoning is a very important thing to address because in a lot of media, be it a book, a movie, or game, there seems to be an unnatural amount of it. Now, for those of you who do not know, irony poisoning is the act of when an emotional core of a story is slowly replaced by self-deprecating humor that generally makes the entire series ruined and basically makes the story pretty terrible. And Sonic suffered this the hardest out of any franchise you can think of, and it's where most of the fans of the series were generally rude about the games, claiming that it was never good, which this is the start of that main issue. But with that out of the way, let's get into a game with a little bit of a better note. Alright, you got that? Good, good. Alright, the next game we're going to cover is Sonic and the Secret Rings, which The storyline is pretty straightforward, although there are a few caveats to this game. Number one, it was part of the storybook phase of Sonic, which is basically where the two games that we're going to touch on focus and have loose inspiration based on stories like Aladdin and Sword in the Stone. However, with a few minor differences and a few situations involving Sonic that we'll have to get into. So that out of the way, let's get into Sonic and the Secret Ring. The game begins with Sonic waking up in some random house and finding a ring that belongs to the genie of the ring itself, named Shara. Which, for those of you who do not know, Aladdin's original story is about the genie of the ring, not the genie of the lamp. This genie pretty much has very limited powers compared to the genie of the lamp named Dark Shari, which I probably butchered that name, and I'm sorry. Sonic is basically told that there's danger and that the story of the Arabian Night is failing. So, in a typical jumping through a storybook fashion, Sonic immediately rushes into the world of the Arabian Night to deal with the problem. However, when he's confronted by Dark Rajin, which finally I said the name right, he attempts to curse the genie of the ring, but accidentally hits Sonic as he jumps in the way, where he is told in order to remove the curse, he must collect 7 powerful rings before 3 days pass or he dies. With this high stakes looming over him, you would think he would start freaking out or get immediately urgent to it. But no, he's completely unfazed by it and immediately gets to the job. From there, you go through several different levels, encountering alternate versions of Sonic's friends who take the roles or names of certain characters within the story of the Arabian Night. Which, it's kind of a trend for certain Sonic games to have this for some reason. I don't know why, it just is. So, now you know where Sonic Prime's idea came from. But anyways, after recovering the 7 rings, it was actually told that Razin Jin wasn't going to use them to remove the curse, but rather become the most powerful being in the world and reshape the world to how he sees fit. So basically the Infinity Stones. He attempts to kill Sonic, but the genie of the ring, whose name basically jumps in the way and gets killed. Sonic, out of sheer rage for the companion that he's met along his very long and perilous journey, uses the 7 rings to turn to Spike Ring Sonic, which is a super form that kind of comes out of nowhere, but there's a lot of interesting things behind it. Number one, it is slightly weaker than the Chaos Emeralds, but it is pretty powerful and impressive. If you want a design look for how it was made or what it looks like, I'll show you. After defeating him using this spiny ring Sonic form that he's retained from the 7 rings power, he later finds out that random twisted contorted glob of metal he was holding was actually the genie's lamp. And using the 3 wishes from the genie's lamp, he restores the world, brings the fallen genie of the ring back to life, and seals the main antagonist in the lamp forever. Razin Jin is defeated, and thus, out of sympathy for the fallen villain, for later we learn that it was actually a close friend or companion to the genie of the ring. Sonic, being the most sympathetic person that you could probably meet in this sort of situation, actually lets a sense of empathy. Though it is in his own snarky way, which people generally criticize, but the game is generally nice. Despite its clunky controls, I think it's okay, and generally its overall plot is pretty fine. And also, we get some pretty interesting character interactions between different variants of Sonic's cast. Although, it was kind of annoying that these games didn't focus on Sonic's main extended cast, which is kind of why a lot of people didn't like how these newer games were approaching things, but overall the game is fine. A few janky controls here and there, but overall it's a little fine, even though it did get lower reviews. So, everyone okay? Everyone fine? Everyone who isn't a Sonic fan generally doesn't feel mad that I might have overlooked certain details or situations within the premise of the game? Good, because now we're going to take a break from all the depression, doom, and glooming by talking about a Sonic game that, why it was criticized and generally given a really bad overall reputation back in the day, a lot of people are generally giving it a second new look. And that game is Sonic and the Black Knight, which honestly was actually pretty fine. While it wasn't as good or generally bad in certain areas as Sonic and the Secret Rings, the game's being revisited by tons of people, and generally people like the visual design of the concept. I mean, they gave Sonic a sword. How do you think that's gonna go? Apparently pretty cool. Not to mention the song Night of the Wind is a really good soundtrack. It's considered one of the several iconic soundtracks in the Sonic series. I would play it, but I don't want to get to. Now, this game is generally interesting because while it does follow the same trend as Sonic and the Secret Rings, it actually has a little more interesting trick next to it because generally Sonic's philosophy as a character kind of contrasts against this world's normal expectations based on how the game's centered around the concept of a knight's code of chivalry and honor and serving a king of loyalty. Which, if you know anything about Sonic's personality, someone who chooses to be free as the wind, this would be something he normally would be turned off by. He even says it himself in the game multiple times, isn't there more to being a knight than serving a king? Which honestly is a really nice way of looking at things because it makes you re-question things that honestly people have a one-sided opinion on. The game begins with apparently Merlin's granddaughter, Merlina, running from a horde of soldiers led by a corrupted version of King Arthur. Using the last remainder of their power, or whatever power they have left, they summon a knight or a hero of the wind. And basically Sonic comes falling out of there. Clearly he was in the middle of minding his own business as we see him fall out of the portal holding 2 chili dogs. Alright, this is starting to feel like an anime isekai, but alright, we'll just get into it. Sonic, looking at this situation and clearly remembering his time in Secret Rings, isn't fazed by this at all and pretty much says he's used to it and kills a majority of the soldiers without any effort whatsoever. And he's not even using a sword yet. From there, he goes to attack King Arthur, or at least a corrupted version of him, but is pulled back by Merlina and states that he is not strong enough, and that generally he needs to destroy a scabbard that he's holding that basically grants him immortality or protects him from harm. Sonic needs to obtain a sword called Calibur. And from there, Sonic is stated, or that he's told, that if he possesses that knight, he becomes the worst knight and the slayer of kings. However, Sonic retorts with this in a very strange line you wouldn't expect to hear him say. He says, quote, "I guess I can't be the hero every time." Which kind of makes me question why or how his moral philosophy stems in what he does as good. But from there, the sword generally seems to work with it pretty well, and despite the motion controls being a little weird with it, and especially when it interrupts your momentum within gameplay, it's generally good. However, story-wise, there's actually an interesting take here. The sword itself is sentient. Calibur generally goes from being a random sword with a cool name to being a advisor or a teacher and an instructor to Sonic, constantly guiding him and trying to show him how to properly be a... I'm just kidding, he generally tries to do those things, but does it in a way that's kind of annoying, where basically he generally mocks Sonic for how he generally acts, and calls him a knave because he sees him as, quote, nothing but a squire. But this isn't for the sake of berating him or just being rude. This is because he actually wants to see if Sonic is worthy of wielding him. Which, honestly, that is a pretty cool trope. Rather than the sword just being worthy of its wielder just by pulling it out, it actually tests whether or not the person wielding it is truly worthy. Which I kind of like that concept there. So from there, Sonic actually gets into a few banterous arguments with Calibur, and Calibur generally berates him and starts by the name Knave the Hedgehog. From there, Sonic is basically tasked with grabbing the Knights of the Round Table's sacred swords in order to be able to destroy Arthur and his immortal scabbard that he wields. However, just like before in Sonic and the Secret Rings, Sonic's extended cast of characters or friends, specifically Knuckles, Blaze, and Shadow, all take the roles of Knights of the Table. Shadow is Sir Lancelot, Knuckles is Gawain, and Blaze is Percival. And generally, where a knight would normally choose to never stray away from a fight and would see it to the end, aka killing their opponent, Sonic doesn't do either of these things. He chooses to retreat, and at the end of every fight, he chooses to actually spare them. For probably two obvious reasons. Number one, he doesn't truly choose to kill his enemies unless it's an eldritch monster, because he still believes they deserve a second chance. And two, they literally mirror his friends. I mean, could you imagine the concept of literally having to end the life of someone who looks exactly like a person you know or care about? Yeah, no. After retaining all of the swords, he later convinces them that King Arthur is generally a corrupt leader, and some of them start to actually notice this, specifically Knuckles, or Gawain, which honestly is a fitting name for him because the story about Gawain evolves around him fighting a large green ogre-like monster. If any of you guys bothered to read the book Gawain the Green Knight, but that's not important. What's important is that you've got all the swords, and generally you can take them back to the smith, who apparently is Tails, which honestly makes sense. Now, it is worth mentioning that other characters like Jet and Silver, who come from spin-off games or other games, generally do show up as knights with their own personal names, which I generally don't know or remember, mainly because of the fact that, they only featured these models in a multiplayer mode, which I generally think is kind of annoying that they never got to do this or bring them into the main story, because last I checked, there weren't 3 knights in the Round Table. There were either 4 to 5. But with that out of the way, let's get back into the main story. After Calibur is fully reforged and grabs all the swords, he's ready to fight. He and Sonic are ready to fight King Arthur. And upon learning this destruction and grabbing the scabbard and defeating him in the fight, which goes as well as a narrow hallway Sonic boss fight can go, it's learned later on that basically there never was a King Arthur. He died years ago, and that what Sonic's been fighting is an apparition created by Merlin in order to keep his legend alive. However, it got corrupted by the scabbard's power. Merlina was planning on using the scabbard in order to grant the world, or the area she's in, immortality. A giant ogre-like soldier, but that's not generally important. What's important is you got all the swords, now it's time to fight King Arthur. And the boss fight goes pretty well, for what a narrow hallway Sonic boss fight can be, for that matter. But after defeating him, it's learned that what you were fighting was a fake. King Arthur died years ago, and what you were fighting was an apparition created by Merlin to keep the legend alive. And Merlina basically uses the scabbard to try to figure out a way to basically make the kingdom, or the world that exists, eternal, because she doesn't want it to die out. Even though how long it's going to take is probably the same amount of time it would take the real world to die out, which, you know, is practically an eternity. However, she generally has a deep sense of philosophical depression over the concept of death, which is implied to be the death of her grandfather, Merlin, which, if you don't know, is the wizard who helped King Arthur when he was a squire and helped him as a leader when he became a king after pulling out Excalibur, the sword in the stone. Sonic explains later on in the game, after you defeat the Eldritch monster in a massive boss fight, that life matters because of the limited amount of time you have. And because something doesn't last forever, you should spend the amount of time with someone or something for what it's worth. And honestly, that's a pretty good message in some areas. Now, I'm not the best at wording things because, again, you're watching one of my videos for Pete's sake. I mean, I'm not really good and I gotta do this for like 3 takes, but generally it's pretty good. And the game, for the most part, is decent. And some people are revisiting again, like I said, so if you want to look at more valid opinions, check them out. Alright, without a wait, let's get into a better game. Now, up until this point, I've only explained a bare minimum plot covering the 2 Sonic games that have a storybook aesthetic and is basically in place of a random fairy tale or folklore that a lot of people know. However, the next game is purely a normal Sonic game and is generally a game that, while there were some repetitive parts of, was actually good during the early 2000s. Now, while a lot of people criticize it for its weird choices, it was a fun game overall. However, I didn't get to fully play it because my mom misunderstood the box art and returned the game out for something else. And that game was Sonic Unleashed. Now, looking at the box art, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people don't like the game. And honestly, I wish I could have continued this because I was playing the Wii version, which didn't have the open world like the Xbox version. But overall, this game was pretty cool, and it had a really nice soundtrack that slapped. Also, it was one of the last few Sonic games that had a really well animated opening to it, which I will show you right now. Editor's note, the soundtrack is cut off due to copyright laws. Yeah, I know. Truly a masterpiece of animations back in the 2000s. Too bad we don't make them like these anymore. But all that aside, the game is generally good. Its platforming is interesting, it's got iconic soundtracks like Rooftop Run, and the story is actually really intriguing. Sonic Unleashed basically has a normal Sonic formula, but doesn't show many characters around, but does deliver in a really fun game with some interesting animations. After the events of the Chaos Emeralds getting drained by Eggman and him literally blowing up the Earth, like splitting it up into pieces to awaken an Eldritch monster, which he would once again lose control of, Sonic's got to go from country to country, basically finding the Chaos Emeralds and restoring their power in order to basically stop these Eldritch horror, known as Dark Gaia. In the scenario, though, the energy of the Chaos Emeralds has taken a negative backlash, giving Sonic a werewolf form during the night, which grants him the ability of both super strength and insanely stretchy arms, which honestly, in a horror movie premise, is kind of scary, and I could kind of see that working out. This cover is also the reason my mom returned the game, because she didn't understand that the werewolf form was the Chaos Emeralds having a backlash and thought it was some sort of demonic entity. But apart from that, the game is generally cool. You got interesting platforming, an open world hub you can move around in, or whatever was considered open back then. And generally, just a really nice story. Along the way, Sonic meets this little character who helps him around the area named Chip. Chip is basically a little companion who Sonic later finds after falling out of the sky, after getting the chaos energy in supersonic form being literally sucked out of him, and basically helps him on his journey with a little bit of witty banter. He's generally a funny character and is really helpful. And definitely doesn't have any random plot convenience later on the story. I mean, that would just be insane, right? Right? Well, apparently, yeah. After traveling across multiple different equivalent or in-universe versions of certain countries in Sonic's world, you later learn that basically Chip is a powerful being known as Light Gaia, the yin and yang to Dark Gaia that exists. And that basically, this was part of a 100,000 year battle that would occur between the two sides that now Sonic finds himself in, where Chip has to be assisted by Sonic in order to seal the monster away. Which, honestly, I can't really blame him. The thing looks like a devastated horror movie monster or something that belongs in a kaiju movie. Just for reference of what this thing looks like, I'm just gonna pull up an image, and I'm sorry if any kid who looks at this gets a little bit traumatized. When the fight finally wraps up and the world is restored, Chip is now required to go back into the sealed realm that the Dark Gaia lies in order to hold him back till the next 100 years. But before he fades away, he says his final goodbyes to Sonic, and he slowly materializes into dust, disappears. All that remains of him is the bracelet that he held around his neck for so long for the entirety of the game, which Sonic holds on to as a sentiment to his lost friend. Hey, Player Negative here. Hope you enjoyed that video. I'm sorry if I was a little too simplistic with my wording and didn't cover certain things. If anything you want to hear about these games in your opinion, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And suggest to me what games you would want me to have a better, narrow explanation or satirical talk through or walkthrough of in the future. I plan on doing a Kirby video, a Shovel Knight review with one of my friends, and a few other videos later on in the future. So, see you later, and I hope you had a good time.